Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3.5A. I've entitled this video, It Was a Team Effort. This video is going to cover pages 178 to 183. Winning independence. Once France had agreed to support the Americans, the Netherlands and Spain also joined in the war against Britain. France, the Netherlands, and Spain all provided loans to the United States. European aids the colonies. On the southwestern frontier, Americans received help from New Spain. In the early years of the war, Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Spanish Louisiana, favored the Patriots. He secretly supplied medicine, cloth, muskets, and gunpowder to the Americans. When Spain entered the war against Britain in 1779, Galvez took a more active role. He seized British forts along the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. He also drove the British out of West Florida. Galveston, Texas is named after this leader. Foreign individuals contribute. After France began to aid the United States, even before other European nations agreed to help the United States, individual volunteers had been coming from Europe. They wanted to join the American cause. Some became leading officers in the American army. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French noble, convinced France to send several thousand trained soldiers to help the Patriot cause. Lafayette, who fought at Brandywine, became one of Washington's most trusted friends. From the German state of Prussia came Frederick von Steuben, who helped train Washington's troops to march and drill. Von Steuben had served in the Prussian army, which was considered the best in Europe. Two Polish officers also joined the Americans. Thaddeus Kosciuszko, an engineer, helped build forts and other defenses. Casimir Pulaski trained cavalry or troops on horseback. Now, you might wonder, why does Casimir Pulaski get such big billing here in Illinois? Well, Chicago is the largest Polish city in the world outside of Poland, and it has approximately 1.9 million Polish people. So if you ever wonder why Illinois celebrates Casimir Pulaski Day, it's because our biggest city has close to 2 million Polish people in that area, and it is the biggest Polish city in the world, not located in the country of Poland. Winter at Valley Forge. The victory at Saratoga and the promise of help from Europe boosted American morale. Washington's Continental Army began preparing for the winter of 1778 and 1777, by building a makeshift camp at Valley Forge. Conditions at Valley Forge were difficult, but the soldiers endured. About 2,000 huts were built as shelter. Several soldiers were improperly dressed, although many did have proper uniforms. As the winter wore on, soldiers also suffered from disease, a common problem in military camps. An army surgeon from Connecticut wrote about his hardships. Primary source, Abbegens Waldo Diary, December 14, 1777. I am sick, discontented, and out of humor. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery. There comes a bowl of beef soup full of burnt leaves and dirt. As news of the hardships at Valley Forge spread, patriots from around the nation sent help. Women collected food, medicine, warm clothes, and ammunition for the army. Some women, like Martha Washington, wife of the commander, went to Valley Forge to help the sick and wounded. The arrival of desperately needed supplies was soon followed by warmer weather. The drills of Frederick von Steuben helped the Continentals to march and fight with new skill. By the spring of 1778, the army of Valley Forge was more hopeful. Washington could not know it at the time, but the Patriots' bleakest hour had passed. How did women contribute to the war effort? When men went off to fight in the Revolution, women took an added work at home. Some planted and harvested the crops. Others made shoes and wove cloth for blankets and uniforms. One woman, Betsy Hager, worked with blacksmith Samuel Leverett repairing cannons and guns for Patriot soldiers after the Battle of Concord. Supporting the army. Many women joined their husbands at the front. They cared for the wounded, washed clothes, and cooked. Martha Washington joined her husband whenever she could. Some women achieved lasting fame for their wartime service. Betsy Ross of Philadelphia sewed flags for Washington's army. Legend claims that she made the first American flag of stars and stripes. A few women even took part in battle. During the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, Mary Ludwig Hayes carried water to her husband and other soldiers. The soldiers called her Molly Pitcher. When her husband was wounded, she took his place loading and firing the cannon. women's rights, and the Revolution. As women participated in the war, they began to think differently about their rights. Those women who had taken charge of farms or their husbands' businesses became more confident and willing to speak out. The Revolution established important ideals of liberty and equality. In later years, these ideals would help encourage women to campaign for equal treatment and eventually to win it. How did African Americans serve in the war? By 1776, more than 500,000 African Americans lived in the colonies. This large racial group was quickly emerging as part of the American identity due to African American contributions during the Revolution. At first, the Continental Congress refused to let African Americans, whether free or enslaved, join the army. Some members doubted the loyalty of armed African Americans. The British, however, offered freedom to some enslaved men who had served the king. Washington feared that this would greatly increase the ranks of the British army. In response, Washington changed his policy and asked Congress to allow free African Americans to enlist. Deciding to fight. About 5,000 African Americans from all the colonies except South Carolina served in the army. Another 2,000 served in the Navy, which, from the start, allowed African Americans to join. At least 9 African American Minutemen saw action at Lexington and Concord. Some African Americans formed special regiments. Others served in white regiments as drummers, fifers, spies, and guides. African Americans like Wentworth Cheswell served the Patriot cause from the start. A New Hampshire schoolmaster, Cheswell was a free African American man who, like Paul Revere, rode all night from Boston to warn his community that the British were on the march. He later enlisted in the army to help fight at Saratoga. Enslaved African Americans faced more difficult choices. If they joined the American army or continued to work on Patriot plantations, the British might capture and sell them. If they tried to flee to the British army to gain freedom, they risked being hanged by angry patriots. Belief in freedom. Yet, many slaves did flee their masters, especially those who lived near the coast. The British Navy patrolled the coast. One British captain reported that, quote, nearly 500 runaway slaves offered their services to him. Toward the end of the war, several thousand enslaved people sought freedom by following British troops through the Carolinas. African American patriots hoped that the Revolution would bring an end to slavery. After all, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that, quote, all men are created equal. The promise of the natural rights professed in the Declaration motivated African Americans to try to secure these rights. Some white leaders also hoped the war would end slavery. James Otis wrote, quote, the colonists are by the law of nature free-born, as indeed all men are, white or black. Quakers, in particular, spoke out strongly against slavery. During the American Revolution, several states moved to make slavery illegal, including Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. Other states also began to debate the slavery issue. American Indians choose sides. At first, both sides tried to persuade American Indians to stay out of the conflict. However, as the war spread to American Indian lands in the West, the Americans and British both tried to win the support of American Indian groups. In the end, the British were more successful in creating alliances. They convinced many American Indians that a Patriot victory would mean more white settlers crossing the Appalachians and taking their land. In the South, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw supported the British. The British encouraged the Cherokee to attack dozens of settlements. Only after hard fighting were Patriot militia able to drive the Cherokee back into the mountains. Fighting was equally fierce on the northern frontier. In 1778, Iroquois forces led by the Mohawk leader Joseph Brant joined with Loyalists in raiding settlements in Pennsylvania and New York. The next year, Patriots struck back by destroying dozens of Iroquois villages. Farther west, in 1778, George Rogers Clark led Virginia frontier fighters against the British in the Ohio Valley. With help from Miami Indians, Clark captured the British forts at Kaskaskia and Cahokia near the Mississippi River. He then plotted a surprise attack on the British fort at Vincennes. Clark's small force spread out through the woods to make their numbers appear greater than they really were. The British commander surrendered Vincennes in February of 1779. Well, that's all I have for you today. Before we go, here is a meme. You might be from Illinois if you know what Casimir Pulaski Day is. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.